Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 117. I'm going to be flying solo for this particular episode because I want to tackle a big topic that is actually remarkably overlooked but extremely important in the baseball world. We're going to be talking about joint hypermobility, how to evaluate it, how to manage it, and just appreciate its overall role in the game and how we keep players healthy and performing at a high level. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. 1 scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients to the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey. Welcome to episode 117. As I mentioned in our opening, I'm going to try to tackle a big topic here, joint hypermobility and how it relates to the baseball and softball world. But there will be some key principles that I think apply to all disciplines, regardless of whether we're talking about swimmers or just folks in the general population that also have encountered that, whether they're trainers or rehab specialists working with folks who have it, or actual end users, patients, weekend warriors, things like that. So like I mentioned, this is a big topic to take on. So what I did was I actually tried to narrow my focus a little bit and come down with the 10 key training considerations for people with hypermobility. And I think, just starting off, number one for me is going to be, we have to appreciate that it actually is a thing. And there's a collection of, folks out there that, whether they're just maybe not in tune with the right assessment measures or just because they don't think to look at it, may overlook the fact that this is actually a relatively prevalent thing in the general population. It's certainly more prevalent in certain populations than others. So I think we can all, really, observe that young kids all tend to be hypermobile, right? Kids contort themselves in all kinds of crazy positions. I have twin 7-year-old daughters and a 3-year-old daughter. All of them can hyperextend their elbows and do crazy things at gymnastics that, their daddy can't even undertake at age 40. So it is a thing. We know that hypermobility is about 3 times higher in females, and there's actually some ethnic components to it as well. So it's more common in those of African, Asian, and Arab origin, where the incidence is actually estimated at greater than 30%. Obviously, that depends on how you classify it. And there's different ways to look at it, whether it's range of motion at a particular joint. We know that passive range of motion can be kind of tricky to assess, depending on how meticulously you stabilize adjacent joints, how hard you push, all those different factors. But the incidence in Caucasians is about 6%. What is very interesting about the baseball world, though, is that it does seem to be substantially higher than the 6% number. So it's likely evident there's a component of natural selection at work, that this is something that we see more commonly in high-level throwers, and it may actually be advantageous for allowing them to, contort themselves into crazy positions and be successful in sometimes very high amplitude or high range of motion movements. So we know it's more common in females, generally more common in African, Asian, and Arab populations than in Caucasians. And it actually is more common in young individuals than the elderly. And certainly we'll see baseball players over the course of a career who just kind of lose out on some of that give to their ligaments. They become a little bit more stiff. And what's interesting is that in the elderly, when we see a lot of hypermobility, the looser joints can actually increase your risk of premature osteoarthritis. But what's intriguing, though, is we see a lot of folks as they get older that lose a lot of range of motion, and there may actually be some protective benefits to that. We look at a lot of people with long-term low back pain. You very rarely see people with debilitating disc pain in their 70s and 80s. More often than not, that happens in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And one of the hypotheses out there is that as the ligaments stiffen up as we age, it may actually create a protective effect where we can't get into positions that might actually provoke things. So we have to recognize that this is a thing. It's higher in certain populations. It's likely higher in baseball players in particular. And we need to understand kind of how to measure it and how to interpret all these different things as we're working with these populations. Now the question then becomes, how do you measure it? And I use the Baton score, as a quick and easy measurement, kind of approach. Baton score is really just a 5-part screen. The fingers extend past 90-degree angle to the dorsal aspect of the hand. So, you look at a pinky, can it bend back past 90 degrees? The thumb contacts the forearm with full flexion. So can you bend your thumb down and basically touch it to the front of your forearm? Greater than 10 degrees of hyperextension at the elbow, greater than 10 degrees of hyperextension at the knee. And all of these 4 can be scored on both sides. And then, can you put your palms flat on the floor with a toe touch movement? So, theoretically, you get a 9 out of 9 if you're really hypermobile on this. And, and certainly, if we look at some of the other factors that we can kind of contribute with is that, the end feel can actually kind of be a subjective helper. If we really think about end feel, we know what a really hard bony end feel really feels like. Certainly we know what like a true muscular end feel might feel like. But when we're talking about hypermobile individuals, a lot of times it's kind of that empty, oh no, what happens if I keep pushing? It might actually, dislocate on me. So a lot of these hypermobile folks really have this hollow end feel where if you feel like you keep pushing, you're going to run into some kind of trouble. So, that for me is an important consideration. What's also interesting as you assess this is there was a study from Bigliani back in 1997 that found that 61% of professional pitchers and actually 47% of position players have a positive sulcus sign in their throwing shoulder, which is just a gross measure of laxity, of having a lot of range of motion, that shoulder having a lot of give from a ligamentous standpoint. But what was really intriguing about this study is that a lot of them had it, the majority of them had it in their non-throwing shoulder as well. So this wasn't just an acquired thing in their throwing shoulder. It was something that we were actually seeing, in the non-dominant side as well. So those are important considerations that kind of play into this discussion of natural selection. The last thing I would say is my buddy Mike Reinhold co-authored a study of MLB pitchers. I believe it came out in 2009, where he looked at average total motion, so shoulder internal plus external rotation in a big league, pitching staff, and he found that the average was 191 degrees. So, as in the back of my mind, assuming we're using similar measurement techniques to what they used in that study, I've always just kind of thrown 200 degrees out as kind of a number I consider is that when, an athlete walks in, they've got greater than 200 degrees of total motion, and I often look at the non-dominant side as an indicator of it. We're probably dealing with someone that is, markedly more hypermobile. So, those are kind of quick and dirty measurements, whether it's a Baton score, subjective end feel, looking at a sulcus sign, and certainly looking at greater total motion, at these joints, at the shoulder of over 200 degrees. I think if you look at all those things big picture, you're probably going to get an appreciation for whether someone's really, really loose. I think the other thing I would tell you is be careful about saying that somebody's really loose just because you see one freaky joint. You'll see scenarios where someone can, really hyperextend their lead knee as a pitcher, but the rest of their body is really normal. That for me is more of an adaptation, something that's come about due to imposed demand, similar to what we would see with like a pitcher gaining, a lot of retroversion at their shoulder or something to that effect. So, point one was identify that's an issue, and point two, obviously is understand how to best measure it, and then, appreciate that you want to take it a little bit further. So, which leads into point three. It's vitally important for you to understand the difference between laxity and instability. And sometimes these words are used interchangeably. Laxity and hypermobility to me are somewhat synonymous in the sense that it speaks purely just to the looseness of a joint. And it usually occurs in multiple or all directions. Conversely, when we talk about instability, that term is associated with an element of pathology, right? So if I fall on an outstretched arm and I have an anterior dislocation of my shoulder, I have a Bankart injury and, associated problems with a Hill-Sachs lesion or whatever it is, usually that's a instability in one direction. I have anterior instability in that situation. Typically it's in one direction, but you'll see scenarios where folks develop like a multi-directional shoulder instability. So certainly laxity can predispose an individual to instability, but it's very, very important to realize that they are not the same thing. Usually when we see instability, it's at one joint, it's related to some kind of traumatic event or a chronic adaptation where, a shoulder got looser and looser and looser. So just understand you can be lax, you can be hypermobile, but not unstable, because you understand how to control it and you haven't developed the, pathology that goes with it. But you also have to realize that you can be unstable but not lax, right? I've seen very tight athletes. You see anterior dislocations in rugby players who have, brutally tight joints. So we just need to appreciate that, that's some of the stuff that may be at work, okay? For our fourth consideration, recognize that hypermobile athletes can often make bad tests look good. So you'd think that just because you see these, arms and legs flying everywhere, you see this element of Gumby that's in place that, it's going to be a little bit of a slam dunk assessment. It actually isn't. And the reason is very simply because most assessments are naturally biased towards those who are proficient with range of motion screens. And what's tricky about a lot of these hypermobile individuals is sometimes they can take these gross tests and make them look good even when they're terribly bad. So using a toe touch as an example, you might see someone who has zero posterior weight shift. They may just lock out their knees into hyperextension and put their hands flat on the floor without any element of like posterior weight shift. They won't find their hips at all. So really it's a knee dominant and spine dominant strategy that overlooks, really we're trying to get into our hips. So one of our goals with working with hypermobile athletes is to figure out a way to share stress over multiple joints instead of just getting an extreme amount of motion at one joint. And laxity can make bad movement look good sometimes, particularly if we're dealing with someone with an untrained eye. And if you need a really good example of this that maybe even takes a little bit further, if you look at the classic functional movement screen, which I do think is a great collection of screens, and we'll talk about it in a second here, but if you get a perfect shoulder mobility score, so kind of the fist to fist test where one arm is behind your back in kind of the handcuff position and the other one's going in the top. So the top arm is externally rotated, the bottom arm is internally rotated. If you can get a 3 on both sides on that, it's probably a pretty good sign in a baseball population that you have a lot of laxity. And the reason is simple. Usually a baseball throwing shoulder has a lot of acquired external rotation. They have more retroversion. And what that allows them to do is put their dominant arm on top and get way, way back, but it's going to be really hard for that dominant arm to kind of go into that handcuff position. And if they're able to get all the way back on their dominant arm, it's probably a sign that, even if they are retrograde, they got a gross amount of instability to get that much internal rotation. And what's interesting, if you can kind of take this observation and then you go and you look at the research. There's a really good study from Garrison in 2012 that basically showed that the looser you were, perhaps unsurprisingly, increased your risk of ulnar collateral ligaments. So if you have a 3 on a shoulder mobility score as a professional baseball player, you are, according to the research, and it's a combination of multiple studies, more likely to need Tommy John. So here's the thing. I still think FMS is a great screen. Why is that? Because that's used as part of a collection of other screens, right? Underneath that same umbrella, you've got a trunk stability push-up. You've got an inline lunge. You've got an active straight leg raise. You've got these tests that don't just heavily relate to flexibility or the range of motion screens that these hypermobile athletes can cheat. Instead, we have a bunch of checks and balances in place to make sure that we actually can tap into a lot of the range of motion that we have. And really what we're looking for with a lot of our screening that I think is really key is looking at active and passive differences, right? If we have someone who's got a 40-degree active straight leg raise and then passively they can go to 110 degrees, that's 70 degrees where an injury can really occur. So we need to make sure that we don't just use screens that kind of naturally gravitate towards making really loose jointed individuals successful. And instead, we need to get them up and challenge them in weight bearing. We need to put them in positions that make it harder for them to demonstrate their motor control in an existing range of motion, or to control their center of mass inside their base of support, so that we can really get a feel for why it is they move well or they don't move well. We just want some justification for what's in front of us. For point number 5, I think we need to understand why something might feel tight. And you will have people who are hypermobile, who have a lot of range of motion, who do still feel tight. And we want to be mindful of this, that we're not just blindly stretching something. So, when we look at it, there's a lot of different reasons that someone might be tight. So first, true muscular shortness, right? This can happen if we have a young athlete who goes through a rapid growth spurt, and their femur stretches out way faster than their quads and their hamstrings can. Like those muscles are fundamentally short for the bony structures that they overlay. Certainly this can also be a consideration. We're talking about immobilization, periods. They've done studies on, rabbit and rat hind limbs where they, mobilize them and they do truly see muscular shortness. This could also be someone who's been sitting at a desk for a really, really long time, or, an athlete who's been post-surgically, not managed maybe correctly, and a lot of the tissue shortness has taken place after a period of immobilization. So that would be the first thing. Probably not super common in the populations we're talking about, but it could be an issue if you have an athlete who's got a big old bone spur on the underside of their elbow, and their elbow's, been stuck in 20 degrees of flexion for long enough. They might actually, have true muscular shortness in some of those elbow flexors that have been, locked there for an extended period of time. Certainly osseous, or bony alignment can be an issue. So, if we have an athlete who lays down bone spurs in their elbow or femoral acetabular impingement and that their hip, they're actually developing bone that is blocking their ability to move. And they may feel tight in their hips because they're effectively running out of space in which they can move. So we have to be mindful of this osseous, / bony alignment. But it's not just extra bone. If I'm someone who's in a raging anterior pelvic tilt and I try to go into hip flexion, if my hips, don't posteriorly pelvic tilt to allow some space to occur in the front, my femur is, effectively trying to work, through a system that's out of alignment. And this is one of the key kind of tenets of the Postural Restoration Institute. And Ron Haruska, its founder, was a great guest previously. So I definitely encourage you to give a listen to his podcast where he talked about, what is and isn't normal asymmetry. But if you have someone that's, dramatically, out of alignment, doing a lot of stretching probably isn't going to get them better. Instead, we've got to, do the right kind of positional breathing. We've got to realign the axial skeleton. We've got to get airflow manipulated and do all these creative things just to get them back to this semblance of neutral. So, if you think about driving a car really fast when it's out of alignment, you're going to cause other problems. And if you stretch a system that's completely out of alignment, you're probably going to create some kind of instability, to build on a previous point. Certainly capsular issues can be, a concern, probably more so in an older population. You'll see a lot of, posterior hip capsule stiffness and people who have prolonged hip mobility limitations. Certainly we'll see capsular changes in, adult rotator cuff repairs and things like that. Probably not something I'm super concerned with a younger population, but it does warrant consideration that sometimes the limitations can be because of capsular stiffness. So the actual, ligamentous structures at a joint don't have enough give to them. And then neural tension is something as well, right? We'll see people who injure an intervertebral disc, they've got a herniation or something, and they get this feeling of tightness into their legs, right? Where it's radiating down, and, last thing you want to do is stretch out neural tension. So I would see a lot of, ulnar nerve symptoms in baseball players that might get worse when people aggressively stretch the shoulder and the neck. if those nerves aren't gliding the way that they should, or they're transiently irritated, you can set them back by doing a lot of stretching. We also have to appreciate, previous injury and, associated soft tissue restrictions. You pull your hamstrings, 5 times over the course of 5 years. There's probably some very dense, nasty fibrotic tissue there. And that's why, manual therapy can be such a crucial inclusion in a rehabilitation program to teach those tissues to deform the right way. And, it's kind of a cool time just because the research we're getting in the fascial community on, how people respond to things like dry needling, cupping, and other interventions is getting more and more clear over the years. So it's an exciting time to appreciate how we might be able to impact some of these things in a more favorable light. And actually have a good podcast guest coming up that I think will be really intriguing in this regard. Protective spasm is another thing, right? If you throw your back out, you'll see scenarios where people are really locked down and they don't want to bend over, they don't want to rotate, they don't want to do anything, but they didn't necessarily lose range of motion, right? They didn't, get into a situation where it wasn't going to come back. Instead, there's just this 2 to 3 day period where maybe they get some manual therapy, or they get muscle relaxers, they get some kind of pharmacological intervention, and it settles down. So it's a tightness that you probably don't want to just stretch out. But the last one that I think is the most important thing that we're seeing, and is the most applicable to this discussion of joint hypermobility / laxity, is protective tension. A lot of times we see people laying down trigger points and kind of this artificial stiffness in places where they otherwise lack basically stability, where they don't have motor control. So the best example I use a lot in the throwing population is going to any major league locker room, or really any baseball locker room, and you're going to see a lot of low right shoulders. And, I alluded to the Posture Restoration Institute. This is kind of what we would call a classic left AIC, right BC posture. You see a lot of low right shoulders, people stuck in scapular depression on their dominant side. But what's really intriguing is a lot of these individuals will feel like kind of this chronic upper trap tightness. And what's unique about it is they're stuck in scapular depression. The upper traps are completely lengthened, but they always seem to want to get massaged on the upper trap and, levator scap, all these things that theoretically, if they were released, are actually going to allow you to get lower and lower. So the question then becomes, what's actually happening? Well, that's their body laying down trigger points in their upper trap to create stability where otherwise lacks it. So the better play with these individuals is actually to treat the exact opposite side of the joint. Go down and take down some tone in lat and teres major and long head of the triceps, some of that musculature and certainly the fascial lines on the inferior aspect of the joint that will allow them to get better scapular upward rotation, better shoulder flexion, and then follow it up with some good exercises that really make it stick. And these people feel a lot better. And it's one more reason why you don't stretch out a lot of like chronic hamstrings tightness. Instead go give them some anterior core control, give them some glute activation, understand how to be stable in the range of motions they have, and good things happen. So, a key lesson here is just don't chronically stretch out protective tension. Instead, when you think you might need to, maybe do a little bit of light soft tissue work just to get them feeling better, or treat the opposite side of the joint. Treat something that's going to allow them to rediscover good quality movement, and certainly follow it up with kind of the right activation exercise, the right strength work, to drive them into much better patterns. We interrupt this episode with a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily, and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and claim my special offer today for 10 free travel packs with your first purchase. I'd encourage you to give it a shot too, especially because of this great offer and because it gives you peace of mind knowing that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, to get that special offer. Now, for point number 6, I think it's important that we appreciate that joint hypermobility is really just part of a bigger overall picture of collagen deficiency. So we talk about why don't people have stiffer joints? It's because they don't make collagen like everyone else, right? And really collagen is vitally important across your entire body. It affects skins, joints, muscles, ligaments, but also visceral organs, blood vessels, your eyes, and a host of other factors. So what's really intriguing is we see these hypermobile individuals, and we actually see a higher incidence of hernia, gastrointestinal reflux, detached retinas, things along those lines. And what's intriguing is there's a great read by Scheitau and Jelani called Clinical Applications of Neuromuscular Techniques, Volume 1. And they dig in really closely on a lot of these concepts of hypermobile individuals. They're the ones that talk about, trigger points, offering an efficient means of creating, kind of short-term stability in otherwise unstable areas. But one of the things that they observe is that hypermobile individuals often present with chronic pain syndromes and an increased tendency to anxiety and panic attacks. So the question then becomes why? Well, if you think about what these individuals need in order to stabilize these loose joints, they need muscular recruitment. What tells your muscles to, to fire up and to stabilize joints? Well, it's your sympathetic nervous system. It's epinephrine, norepinephrine, these stress hormones that get us going. And these are the same things that honestly make us a little bit more constantly wired, a little bit more high energy, always on the go, things along those lines. And so what we have to be mindful of is not just that these folks are going to be more prone to those issues, but there may be even more downstream effects that we have to consider in the context of athletes. It's going to be harder for them to get quality sleep. They may struggle to recover. So when I see a hypermobile individual on an evaluation, I'm usually doing a little bit more of a sports science dive than I otherwise would, right? I want to know a lot more about sleep quality and things like that I might normally pry on an initial evaluation, because in many cases, if you can take care of some of those things, it's going to have this huge downstream effect. So just be mindful of when you get that individual and you get the health history in front of you, and maybe you see some anti-anxiety medications, you shake their hand and their hand's freezing cold, their wrists are popping, and then they sit down in the chair and their foot's tapping like crazy. I'm immediately starting to think that this is someone who's going to test as a 9 out of 9 on the Bateman score and have tons of shoulder, range of motion that might be more concerning. Dr. Alan Posinki is someone who's written quite a bit in the realm of joint hypermobility. His stuff is great online. And he makes a comment that to compensate for stretchy blood vessels and increased venous pooling, most people with hypermobility appear to make extra adrenaline, which may account for the high energy, always on the go lifestyles of many hypermobile people. He also goes on to say that because too much blood is pooling instead of circulating, people with joint hypermobility syndromes usually have cold hands and feet or low normal blood pressure, in addition to lightheadedness on standing. So all these things kind of relate together. Collagen deficiency can create a collection of different things. He also has observed about how fibromyalgia is very common among those with hypermobility, and it makes perfect sense. If you've dealt with folks who have, fibromyalgia, it usually starts as one joint, then becomes a second and a third, and it kind of moves around. And we realize about people who are really hypermobile is they can just easily slip into bad patterns. So if you have one joint that's bothering you, it can almost create this kind of like helicopter effect where, you try to offset it by weight bearing differently or altering your movements. And so you can get into much worse patterns when you have a lot more issues. And it becomes this kind of perpetuating cycle when it's, an individual who has a hard time toning down. They may, have an increased, level of, anxiety about the actual, issues. These people, they'll often talk about being constantly thirsty. They'll be lightheaded. They may have, palpitations. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And, certainly we know that there's, increased risk of degenerative disc disease because the discs are, are more or less rigid. There's just so many different factors, increased bruising, that we have to be mindful of in these populations that are really, really important. But I would take it a step further and recognize that, this builds on some of our evaluation discussions from before, is for me, one of the really big slam dunk kind of observations that has been a game changer in the past is, not just looking at all these big things as part of a picture, but when I see someone who is, blatantly hypermobile, who we recognize with it, but then they have very limited motion in one place. So as an example, if I have someone who's crazy loosey-goosey, 220 degrees of shoulder total motion. They sit in a crazy scapular depression, and then I check them and their shoulder flexion is really limited. If you've been hypermobile for a long time and you don't have near full shoulder flexion, it's a sign to me that you've been in a bad pattern for a really, really long time. That you've actually almost been able to, create some tissue extensibility changes in a negative direction in someone who is collagen deficient. So anytime I see a crazy hypermobile person that's actually lost motion, I'm going to dig in a lot deeper on that joint than I might have otherwise done it if it was maybe a normal range of motion person. And that leads into the point number 7 is remember that structural deficits may exacerbate your laxity. So on one hand, if you're really hypermobile, you're probably more susceptible to ankle sprains and UCL injuries or labral tears and things along those lines. But flipping that in the opposite direction, so it's kind of the chicken and the egg thing, is that some of these structural deficits may actually exacerbate your laxity. So we know the ulnar collateral ligament is an important restraint to valgus stress at the elbow, right? You don't want your hinge joint to basically have to take on too much stress and in other planes. But what we do know is that the UCL actually is a weak resistor to elbow hyperextension. So if we have an athlete who hyperextends like crazy when they throw a baseball or when they do their push-ups or whatever it may be, and then we layer an old calcified ulnar collateral ligament injury or something to that effect, or a labral tear that's going to mechanically take down the stability at the shoulder, we're probably more susceptible to having setbacks with those joints, simply because it's going to be more range of motion and control and less passive restraints that can protect us. For point number 8, there are vital training considerations. So this is probably going to be my biggest point of the night that can go in a number of different directions. But, big picture, our training considerations focus on the idea that you're trying to build motor control in the range of motion that's present rather than trying to establish more range of motion. So what we do know is a lot of these individuals, it's easier to get them to neutral. Why is that the case? Because they have less passive stiffness to overcome, whether that's from ligaments, or from the muscles and tendons, you name it. It's generally easier to get there. And in many cases, cueing alone often works. So in other words, you're not going to have to do a ton of soft tissue work and positional breathing and, capsular stretches and all these different things. The only hard part is that it's a lot harder to keep them there. You give someone who's got a little bit of passive stiffness to fall back on, the right motor control, you get them locked in and they kind of hold it. One of the things that you'll see in a lot of these hypermobile individuals is you might find yourself teaching them the same thing over and over again. You have to really reaffirm it just because they have so many things that in their lives that can really pull them into bad patterns. So, I hate to say it, but they don't tend to be quick learners just because it takes so much more volume, so many more reps to get these patterns a little bit more ingrained, just because they're working with a larger range of motion that they have to control, and they're always trying to find their way a little bit. I would say though that you do need more stability in this population. You need to work harder to stay away from end range, and the reason is simple: is they're more likely to slip into bad patterns both physically and physiologically, right? So there's a functional and a structural component to this. Is if I'm talking about straightening my elbow, I have joint receptors that tell me where my arm is in space. And, in a normal folk, they're telling us when I'm 10 degrees short of 0 degrees, hey, you're getting close to elbow extension. When I can hyperextend my elbow, much further past it, I'm not getting the same feedback from my joint receptors. Their normal is different than what it probably should be. But then, physically, just from a pure range of motion standpoint, there's more area to control. So we probably need to work a lot harder with these individuals, not just in building strength, but also giving them some proprioceptive awareness. Things like rhythmic stabilizations can be really, really helpful in this regard. Building on that, I would always say, remember, it's better to be too tight than too loose. This is something, years and years ago I went back and forth on, and the longer I've been at it, the more I'd rather see someone have the right amount of stiffness than have no stiffness at all. Building on this, just remember, don't just stretch what's tight. You have to ask yourself why it's tight. So we outlined all those different factors, everything from, bony blocks to capsular changes, to true muscular shortness, to protective tension, to neural and, tension, to, some kind of acute injury. All those things play into it. You have to ask why something's tight before you stretch something. We talked about optimizing recovery and systematically fluctuating training stress with hypermobile populations to give them a chance to rebound. And there's certainly a magic middle ground of how people feel, right? You're definitely going to know, what a hypermobile joint feels like. So, a lot of those people who live in the middle are going to be people that benefit from kind of a good blend of mobility-oriented stuff versus stability/motor control exercises. Just some basic training strategies that have worked really well with hypermobile individuals in the past. More isometrics and eccentrics, just giving them a chance to kind of own the range of motions they're in. We've done more isometrics, I'd say, with everybody in light of some of Keith Barr's great research. But certainly our hypermobile individuals seem to work even better with it, particularly because there's probably some biochemical benefits that, for a collagen deficient population, even more than some of our other athletes would get. Another thing is really important is just always ask them where they feel it, because like we said, they can make bad movements look good. So always solicit feedback on where do you feel this, where do you feel this. But you're really just doing your best in the weight room to teach them to create tension in the right places. They'll often just slip and hang out at the joint end range, and instead we actually want an element of muscular strength that's going to protect them. For point number 9, from a mechanical standpoint, don't wait for a stretch that will never come, and don't wait to hang out on passive end ranges. So best example I can give you is, imagine a pitcher with a very, externally rotated, or excuse me, I should say very retroverted shoulder on top of hypermobility. These are the guys that you put them on the table and you lay them back, and there's 150 degrees of external rotation. It just goes back, forever. They almost look like a pitching machine, one of those iron mics, just it goes and goes and goes. So one of the things that we'll often see with this population is they get in this habit of chasing early arm speed. So what will happen is they're almost rushing to find this end range of shoulder external rotation. And they're notorious for spraying balls up and arm side. Sometimes they'll try to throw, make a compensation for it, and they'll throw accidental cutters, as they make their adjustments. But these individuals tend to chase early arm speed. They often stiffen up too late. You'll often see this in prepubescent pitchers who are very hypermobile. They never really get firm on the lead leg. So there's like these young, loosey-goosey across the board athletes that you need to give them good stability in the big picture. And then in more advanced athletes with tons of external rotation, you have to teach them not just to wait for their external rotation stretch to happen. When they're never really going to feel that length across their pec or their anterior shoulder or anything like that. Instead, we need to teach them how to use their hips to create good direction down the mound that allows their arm to settle into a position where they can really utilize, some of that end range control that we've worked hard in our training to develop. So, this speaks a lot to some of the exercise selection that we're going to do. We're going to use a lot of 90-90 holds and ER-IR transitions and things along those lines with everybody. But on our hypermobile athletes, we need to be really mindful of working back into a greater position of external rotation, really accommodating all of the positions that they may get to in their delivery. And finally, for consideration number 10, remember that you actually have to coach hypermobile athletes out of doing something they're really good at. These are the athletes where you turn your back for 2 seconds and they're in the corner, tying themselves into a human pretzel. These are the athletes that pregame are often doing like the 4-hour-long cross-body stretch in the outfield as they mindlessly stare off into the clouds, when in reality they should be doing some good band work, some good rhythmic stabilization, something to create some kind of motor control in the existing range of motion they have. So you really need to be mindful of tactfully counseling them into, hey, you probably don't need to stretch. If there's someone who's naturally drawn to yoga, maybe you do more positions in weight bearing and things like that, as opposed to just doing a lot of stuff on the ground where they can kind of contort themselves in all kinds of crazy different positions. But in general, athletes gravitate towards things that they do well. And hypermobile individuals are those ones that are naturally always going to be, torquing themselves into crazy position. And they're often the ones that'll go to the athletic trainer or the strength coach or whoever it may be to ask to get, stretched aggressively, in the pregame dynamic. So, if they do have that kind of scenario, it's probably them picking the scab just a little bit. Make sure you follow up any kind of passive flexibility initiatives or the right kind of activation exercises to make sure you're putting some good motor control in the system so that you can at least play for the tie with these individuals. So those are my 10 bullet points on joint hypermobility, whether it's identifying it, assessing it, programming for it, training for it, understanding how it relates to the actual, baseball world. And then also, certainly some of the other factors, whether it's physiological, psychological, training approaches, coaching styles that may relate to it. If you are interested in learning more about this, I do have a more involved presentation that I did in our product, Functional Stability Training of the Upper Body. It's functionalstability.com. So there's some good stuff there. And I also have quite a bit of stuff on my website and our YouTube pages and Instagram pages if you want to check out for some sample exercises. But I just can't tell you how underserved this population is, particularly in the baseball community. If you go into pretty much any major league roster, probably a third of your pitchers and, some of your position players as well are going to be very, very loose, and you don't want to treat them exactly like you treat the really, really tight guys. So, and obviously we have a lot of softball folks that listen to this as well. We mentioned that hypermobility is 3 times higher in female athletes than it is in male athletes. So if we're softball folks listening to this, there are a lot of key take-homes, understanding how you can help your athletes, maybe pulling back on a lot of the static stretching, doing more motor control closer to the end range. And keep in mind, you don't have to go all the way to the end range to get the benefits. You're probably going to get, carryover of 10, 15 degrees in each direction on isometric work. So lots of low-hanging fruit in this regard that you can pick if you understand how to identify it and go from there. So hopefully you found this useful. And, I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to me blabber on about this, but it's a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, and certainly hope that this will help you and some of your athletes as you apply it.